The air in Cincinnati was already thick with the smoke of foundries and coal fires, but by the autumn of 1860, it was the acrid fumes of political rhetoric that burned the throats of its citizens. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a man whose very name was a curse word south of the Ohio River, had not simply divided the nation. It had shattered the comfortable illusion of peace. Our protagonist, Elias Vance, a young journeyman printer who spent his days setting type for the Cincinnati Enquirer, felt the division keenly. He lived on the northern bank of the Ohio, but his heart had ties to the bluegrass country of Kentucky, just a ferry ride away. Every issue he typeset carried screaming headlines. Secession threatens. Southern fire readers ignite crisis. Union in peril. Elias knew how to spell the words, but he was struggling to grasp their terrifying meaning. At 22, Elias possessed the wiry strength of his trade and eyes perpetually stained with ink. He believed in the Union, not as a political concept, but as the practical reality of shared river trade and common progress. Yet, the arguments now spilling from the saloons and market squares were no longer about tariffs or territories. They were about the unholy institution of slavery, a subject Elias had always tried to keep at arm's length. One blustery evening, as the newsboys hawked the latest edition detailing South Carolina's formal withdrawal, Elias found himself at the bar of the Anchor and Quill, a favorite haunt for rivermen and newspaper men. He stood beside old Silas, the paper's chief editor, a staunch Unionist whose voice had grown hoarse from shouting down every Confederate sympathizer in the city. "They think they can just walk away, Elias," Silas rasped, slamming his pewter mug down. "Like a spoiled child leaving the dinner table. They think the laws of this nation are merely suggestions." A man named Cole, a gruff stevedore with family in Alabama, spat onto the floor. "It's their right, Silas. You Northerners think you've got the monopoly on morality. They've been pushed too far, and that damn Lincoln is the match to the powder keg. Let them go. Let this country finally be rid of that high-handed Republican meddling." The sudden, sharp silence in the saloon was more menacing than any noise. The old division North versus South, free labor versus enslaved capital, had crystallized in the space between the two men. It was no longer a distant debate among Washington politicians. It was here, across the bar, threatening to ignite their city. Elias had always been a man of words, not action. His weapon was the composing stick, not the rifle. But as Cole glared, his eyes alight with a dangerous, defiant pride, Elias felt a cold dread mix with a rising heat of conviction. He looked out the window toward the dark, turbulent waters of the Ohio River, the physical border that had suddenly become the psychological chasm dividing a once united people. In his mind, the threat of war had always been a thing of abstract nouns and foreign lands. A news story he printed. Now, with the sound of a distant militia drill echoing from across the river, it was a scent in the air, a tension in the muscle, and a grim promise that was rapidly becoming his local reality. The paper was done printing the warnings. Soon, it would be printing the casualty lists. Elias knew, with sickening certainty, that he would be setting the type for his own fate. The news of Fort Sumter did not arrive in Cincinnati on a printed sheet. It arrived as a shockwave. When Elias Vance walked into the composing room of the Enquirer on the morning of April 13, 1861, the usual clatter of the presses was subdued, replaced by a low, desperate humming. The headline of the extra edition, already being rushed to the streets, was short, stark, and final. Sumter falls. Rebellion begins. For 34 hours, the Confederate cannons had pounded the Union garrison in Charleston Harbor. The official opening act of the war had come not with a glorious, pitched battle, but with a siege and a surrender. Yet, the effect was electric. The abstract threat that had brewed for months was now a concrete act of treason. Old Silas, the editor, his face a road map of worrying, addressed the men over the noise. "Gentlemen, the talking is done. Lincoln has called for 75,000 volunteers to put down this rebellion. The Union needs men, and the time for neutrality is over." Elias felt the words lodge in his chest. In the space of an hour, The simmering tensions of the anchor and quill had boiled over into a national crisis. The necessity was simple. The flag had been fired upon. The feeling that swept the city was not fear, but a furious, almost joyous, patriotic clarity. He walked out of the shop and found the streets transformed. Banners were unfurled from windows. Women were sewing stars onto makeshift flags. And outside the recruitment office, a line of men snaked down the block. They were clerks, dock workers, farmers' men who had never handled anything heavier than a ledger or a plow. Elias saw Cole, the stevedore who had argued for Southern rights, standing near the front of the line, his face grim. He wasn't enlisting for the Confederacy. He was choosing his river, his city, his union. The decision was not easy. Elias had a life, the smell of fresh ink, the precise, rhythmic work of the typesetter, and above all, his mother, widowed and dependent on his meager wages. That evening, he went home to their small apartment above a cooperage, the scent of oak and iron a familiar comfort. His mother, Martha, a woman whose spirit was tougher than the worn muslin she mended, was waiting. She didn't need the newspaper to tell her what was coming. She had read the intent in Elias's eyes that morning. "You're going," she stated, not as a question, but as a recognition of an inevitable, terrible truth. Elias tried to protest, to explain the necessity, the 90-day enlistment, the certainty that the crisis would be resolved quickly. "Mother, it's just a show force. They'll see the numbers. They'll back down. I'll be back before the fall harvest." Martha simply held up his father's old tin medallion, a token from the Mexican-American War that had never made it back from the battlefield with him. "Your father said the same. They always say it will be quick, Elias, but war is a glutton that eats up the years and the men who feed it." But she did not forbid him. She helped him pack a small, worn valise with thick socks and his best shirt. In the silence of that final night, her acceptance was a heavier burden than her resistance would have been. The next morning, Elias stood before the recruiting officer. He signed the papers, traded his composing stick for a stiff, ill-fitting uniform, and took the oath to preserve, protect, and defend. The moment he swore those words, his life as Elias Vance, the printer, dissolved. He was now Private Vance, 1st Ohio Volunteer Infantry. As he marched out with his company, the cheers of the crowd fell distant, a raw, temporary sound. His gaze was fixed on his mother, standing small and resolute on the porch, clutching the only piece of his father she had left. The river, that ancient boundary, lay behind them, but ahead lay Virginia, the sound of the enemy's guns, and the long, blood-soaked journey toward the future of the nation. The train ride to Manassas Junction had been hot, cramped, and filled with the boisterous, naive confidence of men who still believed war was a grand adventure. Private Elias Vance, newly dubbed printer by his comrades for his quiet manner and ink-stained hands, arrived in Virginia expecting a skirmish. He found the gates of hell wide open. It was a bright, sticky Sunday morning in July 1861, perfect for a picnic, but the spectators who had followed the army out from Washington soon realized this was no parade. The air, already heavy with summer humidity, began to vibrate with a sound Elias had never conceived of, the sustained, ripping roar of cannon fire. The 1st Ohio was rushed onto Henry House Hill, a gentle slope that quickly transformed into a slaughterhouse. Elias's company was deployed in a hastily formed line, told to hold their position against a wave of Confederate troops stiffened by the newly arrived General Thomas Jackson, a man who, according to a rallying rebel officer, stood like a stone wall. Elias raised his rifle, the heavy Springfield feeling alien and unwieldy in his hands. He had trained on targets. He had not trained on living, breathing men, clad in homespun gray, running toward him with fixed bayonets and shrieking a strange, high-pitched cry that curdled the blood, the infamous rebel yell. The noise was instantaneous and overwhelming, a blinding, perpetual thunder. The volley fire of muskets sounded like tearing canvas. The cannonballs screamed overhead like banshees, and the air was instantly choked with acrid, white smoke. Elias could see nothing clearly, Only flashes of orange fire and the blurred figures of his enemy advancing through the haze. His first shot was a blur. He loaded the powder and ball with trembling fingers, raised the rifle, and pulled the trigger. He didn't aim, he simply pointed into the smoke. When the recoil hit his shoulder, he flinched, his senses reeling. Beside him, a young farm boy named Timmy, who had bragged constantly of his prowess with a hunting rifle, dropped his weapon. There was no sound of a scream, just a wet, sickening thud, and a crimson stain blossoming across the front of his blue tunic. "Printer, load, God damn it, load," bellowed Sergeant Miller, his face grimy with sweat and powder. The sight of Timmy's sudden, senseless demise shattered the last remnants of Elias's civilian innocence. This was not the quick, glorious victory the newspapers had promised. This was brutal, chaotic, and personal. He was no longer fighting for abstract principles. He was fighting to keep the man next to him alive, and to prevent the man running toward him from doing the opposite. He kept firing, driven by a primal, animal terror. The heat was suffocating, the smoke stung his eyes, and the ground was becoming slick with mud and something warmer. He saw a rebel soldier stumble 20 feet away, clutching his shoulder, and the immediate, sickening thought that I did that was instantly replaced by the instinct to reload. Hours crawled by like days, ammunition ran low. The Union lines, assaulted fiercely on the flanks, began to waver. Men were no longer standing shoulder to shoulder. They were stumbling backward, tripping over their dead comrades, the initial discipline dissolving into a panic-stricken retreat. Sergeant Miller grabbed Elias by the collar. "It's over, Printer. Fall back. Fall back." Elias turned and ran, not with military purpose, but with the frantic, ragged desperation of a man escaping a burning building. He ran past abandoned artillery pieces, discarded knapsacks, and the grotesque stillness of bodies sprawled face down in the dirt. He ran past the same picnic blankets he had seen earlier, now littered with the remnants of abandoned lunches, a surreal tableau that highlighted the foolish optimism that had brought them here. When he finally collapsed miles later, in the relative safety of the rear, Elias was caked in dust, sweat, and the blood of others. The thunder of the battle was fading, replaced by the desperate cries of the wounded. He realized he had lost his hat, his canteen, and the naive belief that he was invincible. The war had not been a simple headline on a page. It was a searing fire that had burned away his youth and left him with nothing but the brutal, primal memory of the terror that now defined him as a soldier. The raw, adrenaline-fueled terror of Manassas faded, replaced by the crushing, persistent weight of the campaign. For Private Elias Vance and the shattered remnants of the 1st Ohio, the war was no longer fought in a single desperate clash. It was fought one agonizing mile at a time under a sun that seemed determined to bake the life out of them. Following the defeat, Elias found himself traversing the undulating, dusty terrain of Virginia, part of a vast, demoralized army being organized into the mighty Army of the Potomac. The long march became the defining reality of his existence. Every day began before the sun with the shrill, unwelcome call of the bugle. Sleep was a meager comfort, often taken in a damp field or beneath the flimsy protection of a half-broken dog tent. Then came the march. 20 miles, 25 miles, sometimes more, with a 60-pound load of rifle, ammunition, blanket, and meager rations pressing down on shoulders already raw and chafed. The biggest enemy was not the Confederates, who remained elusive after the battle. It was the relentless trinity of hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. Their diet was a monotonous cycle of hardtack of flour and water cracker so hard it often had to be soaked or hammered to be edible, and salt pork greasy, poorly preserved, and often rancid. The men lived in a constant state of mild starvation, their bodies consuming their own meager reserves. Elias, a city boy accustomed to solid meals, felt his energy drain away, leaving him hollow-eyed and perpetually weak. Water was the most precious commodity. Marches were often conducted in single-file columns, raising blinding clouds of fine, Red Virginia dust that coated their uniforms, clogged their nostrils, and settled on their tongues. When they found a stream, the rush was immediate and disorderly, forcing men to drink the silty runoff, knowing the risk of dysentery, the notorious quick-step, which often killed more soldiers than enemy bullets. Another day, printer, another mile closer to God's damn furnace, muttered Corporal Bennying, a grizzled farmer from the northern counties who had taken Elias under his wing. It was in this shared crucible of suffering that the strongest bonds were forged. They were not friends in the civilian sense. They were brothers in misery. They shared their last ration of coffee, helped carry the rifle of a man whose feet were too blistered to walk, and cleaned the bodily wastes of those too weak to move from their tents. One afternoon, during a forced march that lasted well into the sweltering twilight, Elias collapsed. His canteen was empty, his legs were giving out, and the pack on his back felt like a granite slab. He simply sagged onto the dusty roadside, too tired to even feel ashamed. Bennying, a few paces ahead, stopped and trudged back, his own face a mask of exhaustion. He didn't offer a lecture or a helping hand. He simply kicked Elias's rifle. "Get up, printer. That rifle costs 50 cents to replace. Your life is free, but you'll lose it right here if you lay down," Bennying said, his voice flat. He then hoisted Elias's pack onto his own aching shoulders. "Now walk. We'll alternate carrying this until we hit camp." Elias, humbled and revived by the unexpected act of sacrifice, found a new reserve of strength. That shared burden, the understanding that Bennying was adding Elias's suffering to his own, was the unspoken contract of the infantry. They were fighting for the Union? Yes, but day to day, they were fighting for the man next to them. As they finally stumbled into a temporary encampment, their feet swollen and throbbing, they paused to look back at the endless column of blue trailing behind them. They were ragged, dirty, and utterly drained, but they were still moving. The long march was stripping them of their youth and their clean uniforms, replacing them with calloused endurance and a fierce, loyal dependence on one another. The war was less about grand strategy and more about the simple, daily effort to survive. The autumn of 1860 brought no relief, only the grim promise of a decisive clash. After the humiliation of their previous defeats, the Army of the Potomac was chasing the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, which had boldly invaded the North. The chase ended near Shopsburg, Maryland, where both armies converged around Antietam Creek. This was not a pre-planned battle. It was an accidental, bloody collision. For Private Elias Vance, the day of September 17th began in the pre-dawn mist near a cornfield. His company, still part of the weary 1st Ohio, was positioned near General Hooker's the 1st Corps, ready to spearhead the attack. The mood was different from Manassas. There was no naive excitement, only a cold, professional dread. The order to advance came, just as the sun began to burn off the fog. The attack was launched into the infamous Miller cornfield. It was perhaps the most sustained, chaotic fighting Elias would ever witness. As they moved through the tall stalks, visibility dropped to mere feet. The cornfield became a meat grinder, with regiments charging forward, firing volleys, only to be cut down by unseen enemies hiding just yards away. "Keep the line straight. Don't break," Sergeant Miller screamed, his voice strained. Elias saw men dissolve beside him, their last sound a choked gasp as they pitched forward into the rows of corn. The sounds of musketry were so continuous that they ceased to be individual shots and became a single, monstrous roar, punctuated by the dull thud of lead hitting flesh. The cornfield was taken and retaken by both sides multiple times. By the time Elias staggered out, the stalks were mown down as if by a scythe, and the ground was literally carpeted with dead and dying soldiers. The once green field was now a mud-churned tableau of gray and blue. The battle shifted south. Later, that morning, Elias' brigade was rushed toward the center of the Union line, a sunken farm road that the Confederates had turned into an impenetrable trench. This simple lane became known as Bloody Lane. When the 1st Ohio reached the position, they were met by a hail of fire. The road was barely wide enough for 2 wagons, but it was crammed with Confederate soldiers who had excellent cover. The fight became a brutal, static exchange of fire at point-blank range. Elias was low on ammunition and even lower on hope. He saw his friend, Corporal Benning, take a hit to the leg. Benning collapsed, but kept trying to load his rifle, his face twisted in pain and fury. Elias dropped to his knees beside him, trying to tear open a cartridge paper with teeth that felt too numb to work. Printer ... don't stay here. Benning gasped. Get back. I can't move. Elias ignored him, focusing on the mechanical motions of loading his rifle, his training kicking in over his fear. He felt a sudden, sharp sting in his right arm, a grazing wound that ripped his sleeve but thankfully missed the bone. The pain was a blinding flash, but it served only to sharpen his focus. He saw a gap in the Confederate line, a fleeting moment of confusion among the gray-clad soldiers. It was in that moment the tide of the battle paused, the air thick with smoke and the smell of blood, that the decisive shift began. Union artillery, having finally moved into position, began to pound the Confederate trenches with devastating accuracy. The men in gray, having held the line for hours against superior numbers, suddenly broke. They poured out of the sunken road, running for their lives. Elias rose, ignoring the throbbing in his arm, and cheered with a raw, desperate voice that was unrecognizable to him. He was covered in soot, deafened by the noise, and utterly spent, but the Confederates were retreating. Antietam, the single bloodiest day in American military history, was a tactical draw, but strategically, it was the turning point. Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North had been thwarted. For Elias, it was the point where the cost of the war became real and immense. He had lost many friends, sustained his first injury, and learned the terrifying truth that pivotal moments are not neat, cinematic triumphs, but messy, agonizing acts of endurance and sacrifice. They had held the line, and the Union had survived to fight another day. Antietam had shifted the tide, but the war was far from won. Following the battle, the Confederate Army retreated, establishing a strong, defensive presence in northern Virginia. The Union command desperately needed intelligence on General Lee's next move, particularly the location and strength of his supply depots along the vital rail lines. Private Elias Vance, the former printer, was an unlikely candidate for espionage. He was quiet, observant, and possessed a memory honed by years of setting complex type. Crucially, his Ohio roots and lack of a thick New England accent allowed him to blend in better than most. Sergeant Miller, recognizing Elias's quiet intelligence, recommended him for a dangerous, clandestine assignment. Elias was pulled from his regiment and brought before a major in the intelligence division. His mission: infiltrate the area around Stanton, a major Confederate logistics hub, verify the location of a rumored arms cache, and bring back details on troop movements. You're going in clean, Private, the major said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. No uniform, no papers connecting you to the Union. You are a civilian laborer, looking for work and maybe sympathetic to the cause. Understand the penalty for capture. The day Elias slipped through the picket lines, leaving the familiar blue ranks behind, felt profoundly disorienting. He was dressed in worn, civilian clothes, his rifle replaced by a hidden dagger, and his military purpose concealed beneath a veneer of easy conversation. The landscape instantly changed. There was no comforting rhythm of marching boots, only the constant, paranoid need to look over his shoulder. His journey was a tense navigation of fear and deception. He traveled by night, slept hidden in thickets, and relied on meager supplies. His destination was a small tavern outside Stanton, believed to be frequented by Confederate quartermasters. Elias entered the tavern, the Red Hound, late one damp evening. It smelled of cheap whiskey, stale tobacco, and desperation. He ordered a drink and listened. The room was full of soldiers in gray, their conversation loud and careless, fueled by alcohol and overconfidence. He adopted a persona: transient worker from Tennessee, seeking transport north. He even offered a few mild criticisms of the Yankee invaders, a terrifying hypocrisy that made his stomach churn. After a tense hour, he found a table next to a bloated, talkative quartermaster named Corporal Hayes. Elias, using the quiet, attentive listening skills he used to possess at the printer taking dictation, steered the conversation subtly towards supplies. Hayes, eager for a sympathetic ear, complained bitterly about the supply bottlenecks. They're piling up everything at the old Mossenon mill, near the river crossing, waiting for the train to Richmond, Hayes slurred, drawing a rough map in the condensation on the table. Got enough rifles there to equip another brigade. Damn dangerous, keeping it all in one place, but generally demands speed. Elias committed the details: the mill's proximity to the river, the number of guards mentioned, the estimated shipment date to memory. Every muscle in his body was screaming at him to flee. He was surrounded by the enemy, and a single wrong word would mean a quick trial and the rope. His moral limit was tested. Was he a soldier or a spy? The difference felt like the distance between honor and cold-blooded necessity. The biggest test came at the tavern door. Elias went to leave, his mission complete, when a sentry challenged him, demanding his papers. "Where are you going?" "Civilian." The guard snapped, his hand resting on his pistol. Elias looked the sentry dead in the eye, his fear channeled into a sudden, icy composure. "I'm heading north, sir, looking for my kin. This town is dry of work, and I ain't looking to stay where the army's eaten all the wages." He spoke with a manufactured frustration, a common complaint among locals. The sentry, bored and perhaps influenced by the alcohol fumes, merely grunted and waved him on. "Get out of here then, but keep off the main road past midnight." Elias walked away, his stride casual, but his heart hammering against his ribs. He had navigated the enemy's territory and, more terrifyingly, their trust. He had sacrificed his uniform, his identity, and his peace of mind, all for a few crucial lines of information. He was no longer just a man who fought in the ranks. He was a silent weapon wielded in the darkness. His escape back across the Union lines was an arduous, paranoid blur. When he finally delivered his intelligence that confirmed location of the Mossenon Mill arms cache, he knew he had contributed more to the war effort than he had with his rifle at Antietam. But the cost was immense. The man who returned was quieter, his eyes sharper, and the memory of deception was now a permanent stain on his soul. While Private Elias Vance was grappling with the moral compromises of espionage, his former commander, Captain Alistair Thorne, was facing the equally agonizing burden of command. Thorne was a man of 30, a former lawyer from Cleveland, whose crisp uniform now often hung loose on a frame thinned by worrying and lack of sleep. After the brutal failures of the early campaigns and the grinding attrition of the march, Thorne no longer saw his men as numbers on a ledger. He saw Elias, the quiet printer. He saw the empty space where Timmy, the farm boy, used to stand, and he saw the permanent limp of Corporal Bennying, evacuated after Antietam. These were the human costs of the maps and arrows he was ordered to follow. The command post was a stark contrast to the trenches. Thorne sat in a temporary, canvas-roofed headquarters near Fredericksburg, staring at a massive, detailed map of the Rappahannock River Valley. The air was dry and smoky, scented with burning pine and official correspondence. Unlike the private, whose fear was immediate and personal, Thorne's was strategic and far-reaching. He was responsible for the lives of 200 men, and the pressure was a constant, metallic taste in his mouth. His current dilemma was agonizingly simple. The new commanding general had ordered a rapid push across the river to engage the Confederates before they could heavily fortify the heights above Fredericksburg. The reconnaissance reports, however, were inconclusive. Thorne suspected the order was based more on political expediency, the need for a quick Union victory, than on sound military assessment. "Captain," said his aide, Lieutenant Davies, pointing to a crossing point on the map, "intelligence confirms the enemy has positioned batteries here, covering the ford. A frontal crossing will be costly, Thorne repeated, leaning back in his camp chair. The military euphemism felt insulting. Costly meant a 50% chance of seeing his regiment chewed to pieces before they reached the far bank. Costly meant writing 50 more letters to widowed mothers. Thorne knew the ground-level reality. He had seen the precision of Confederate musketry at Antietam. To order his men, tired and dispirited, to cross an open river under direct artillery fire was a calculated act of cruelty. Yet, the general's order was unequivocal: attack at dawn. He wrestled with his oath. His duty was to the chain of command, to the grand strategy, to end the war swiftly. If he delayed, he would be guilty of insubordination, and perhaps forfeit the element of surprise for the whole army. If he obeyed, he would be guilty of needlessly sacrificing his men against a fortified position. The night before the scheduled assault, Thorne walked through the lines of his regiment. He spoke quietly to his men, ensuring their rifles were clean and their meager rations distributed. He saw the trust in their eyes, the unspoken belief that their captain would not lead them into a hopeless trap. That trust felt heavier than any cannonball. Around midnight, Thorne made a decision that would forever mark him. He drafted a coded, cautious message to the divisional commander, deliberately exaggerating the enemy's observed strength at the river crossing, and citing the near impossibility of moving the pontoons through the thick fog reported by his advance scouts. It was not a lie, but it was a calculated distortion of the truth, a small act of insubordination designed to save lives. He knew the potential consequence: a court-martial, the end of his career, and the ruin of his reputation. But, as he looked at the sleeping forms of his men, worn down by the long marches and the raw terror of battle, he knew he could not send them into that obvious trap. His duty to their lives superseded his duty to an ill-conceived order. The general, receiving similar reports from other wary officers, begrudgingly postponed the main assault by 12 hours. It was a temporary reprieve, but it allowed the larger strategy to be reevaluated, eventually shifting the main point of attack away from Thorne's position. As the sun rose on the day they were supposed to have died, Captain Thorne felt a bitter relief. He had saved his men, but the scar of command, the agonizing choice between obedience and morality, was now etched onto his soul. He had crossed a line that no manual of war could define, and he would carry the weight of that moral compromise into every future battle. For Martha Vance, Elias's mother, the war was not fought in cornfields or trenches. It was fought in the silence of their Cincinnati apartment, measured out in the arrival of mail and the ceaseless ache of worrying. After Elias had left, the noise and bustle of the city, which had always felt comforting, began to sound hollow, a jarring contrast to the grim news that drifted north from Virginia. Martha had returned to work as a seamstress, stitching heavy fabrics for military uniforms, her fingers perpetually sore. Her days were a relentless cycle of work and waiting. The cost of living had skyrocketed. Flour, coal, and sugar were now luxury items, snatched up by opportunists or diverted to the military effort. Every purchase was a calculation, a moral compromise between what her body needed and what she could afford. The true currency of the home front, however, was information. Every few weeks, a letter would arrive, penned in Elias's familiar, precise hand, though the writing was often smudged with dirt or hastened by fear. October 1862. Dearest Mother, I am well, or as well as one can be. We were near Shopsbeg, and it was terrible. The ground itself seemed to bleed. I cannot write of the details. You wouldn't believe them. I pray constantly for the end of the marching. Please do not worry if the letters stop for a time. We are moving quickly. I miss the smell of ink and the quiet of my room. Hold to the hope that I will be home soon. Your devoted son, Elias. Martha would read and reread the letters, searching for the man beneath the soldier, ignoring the ominous gaps and the things he couldn't write. The news, when it arrived officially, was always sanitized, speaking of strategic withdrawals and severe losses without naming the faces. But the real, unfiltered news came with the casualty lists. These were printed with devastating regularity, pinned up in the post office window, and they were the most terrifying typography Martha had ever seen. She would steel herself and read down the lists of the killed, the wounded, and the missing, her eyes skimming names from Ohio regiments, praying Elias Vance would not appear. Her neighbor, Mrs. Perkins, a woman who had seen 2 sons enlist, was not so lucky. One afternoon, Martha helped her fold a small, blood-stained Union jacket that arrived in a box labeled Deceased Effects. Mrs. Perkins didn't cry. She simply became silent, a permanent shadow settling over her face. Martha realized that the fear of a missing name was almost worse than the grief of a confirmed one. The latter, at least, brought a terrible, final peace. The moral compromises were subtle but pervasive. The city was full of profiteers, men who bought up cotton and sold it at exorbitant prices, or who supplied the Union Army with shoddy equipment that fell apart under heavy use. Many of Martha's own neighbors, loyal Unionists, were now participating in illegal speculation, trading in scarce goods to make money off the scarcity the war had created. Martha herself was tested. Her employer, the owner of the tailoring shop, was clearly overcharging the government for the uniforms she stitched. One day, the owner asked Martha to use cheaper, easily frayed thread for the linings, a compromise that meant the uniforms wouldn't last a month of heavy use. Martha hesitated. To refuse meant losing her job, and losing her income meant starvation. It's for the war effort, Martha, the owner said with a cynical smile. And besides, the boys need the clothes now. She took the cheaper thread. It was a minuscule act of betrayal, but it left a bitter taste. She was contributing to the effort that sustained the war, but she was also indirectly contributing to the poor equipment that might fail a soldier, perhaps even Elias, when he needed it most. She learned that on the home front, sustaining the effort meant sacrificing not just money and comfort, but also small pieces of one's integrity. The echoes of the battlefield were loud in the silence of her home, the distant sound of trains carrying the wounded, the sight of a veiled woman in black, and the pervasive hunger that gnawed at her stomach. The war had consumed her son, and now it was steadily consuming her life, leaving behind a resilient, but deeply scarred, civilian. By the spring of 1865, the war had become a matter of will. The glorious idealism that had fueled the initial enlistment was long gone, replaced by a grim, bone-deep exhaustion. The Union Army, though battered, was relentless. Elias Vance, hardened by 4 years of marching, spying, and fighting, was now a corporal, his former printing skills evidenced only by the precise way he cleaned and assembled his rifle. The siege of Petersburg had stretched the Army of Northern Virginia to its breaking point. For months, the Union and Confederate lines had faced each other across miles of trenches and earthworks, a vast, static, and terrifying landscape of attrition. Life was a monotonous rotation of watch duty, digging, and anticipating the inevitable, bloody charge. Elias and the remnants of the 1st Ohio were stationed near Fort Stedman, their morale held together by the thin thread of knowing that the end, however bloody, was finally near. Rations were better than in the early war, but the constant dampness, the pervasive smell of unburied waste, and the gnawing anxiety wore down the men's spirits more effectively than any bullet. "We're fighting shadows now, Corporal," murmured Private Higgins, a replacement recruit who looked barely old enough to shave. "They're out of shoes and out of food. Why do they keep fighting?" Elias looked across the barren, torn up no man's land toward the Confederate trenches. "They're fighting because they're soldiers, Higgins, like us. They don't know how to stop." That grim determination was the only thing sustaining both sides. The tension broke in the first week of April. Lee's desperate attempt to break the siege failed, and the order came down the Union line. The final push was on. The Army of the Potomac, now a massive, unstoppable machine, broke through the thin Confederate defenses. The objective was not just victory, it was the total dismantling of the enemy's ability to wage war. The battles that followed at Five Forks, at Sailor's Creek were fought with a feral desperation. These were no longer organized clashes, they were chases, melees, and desperate stands. Elias found himself involved in skirmish after skirmish, the fighting becoming more personal, more brutal, as the enemy realized their cause was lost. During the engagement near Sailor's Creek, Elias's company was tasked with clearing a wooded area where a detachment of Confederates had barricaded themselves. The air was thick with smoke and the crashing sound of timber being ripped apart by cannon fire. Elias led a small squad forward, using the cover of the dense woods. They stumbled upon a small, makeshift Confederate hospital, a barn filled with wounded men, tended by a single, overwhelmed surgeon. As they approached, a young rebel officer, his face drawn and defeated, stepped into their path. He held a pistol, but his hand trembled violently. "We surrender. Damn it," the officer screamed, his voice breaking. "We are done. I have 60 wounded men here. Just take the weapons and leave them be." Elias raised his rifle, but did not fire. The fighting urge, which had driven him for 4 years, suddenly hit a wall of exhaustion and common sense. This was not a final stand, it was a final capitulation. He looked at the trembling officer, saw the same exhaustion he felt, and lowered his weapon. "We take the weapons," Elias said, his voice husky. "And the prisoners. You'll be treated." The decisive action came not from a single moment of glory, but from the cumulative weight of this relentless, final push. Days later, word spread through the Union ranks like wildfire, traveling faster than any telegraph. The enemy general was trapped. The Confederacy was folding. On April 9, 1865, near a small, inconspicuous place called Appomattox Courthouse, the grinding march of the Union Army finally stopped. Elias stood with his regiment as the news was officially confirmed. There was no wild cheering, no celebratory gunshots. The men were too weary, scarred for that. There was only a profound, silent relief. The war was over. The terrible, grinding necessity that had sustained them through the hunger, the marches, and the carnage had finally lifted. They had won the war, but the cost, etched into the faces of every surviving man, meant that the victory felt heavy, not light. The surrender at Appomattox was an event marked by silence, not celebration. Elias Vance watched from a distance the defeated Confederate officers, impeccably dressed despite their defeat, formally stacked their arms. There were no cheers from the Union lines, only a profound, almost reverent quiet. The soldiers understood. They were witnessing the burial of a nation's terrible war, and it felt too solemn for triumph. Elias spent the next few weeks simply waiting for the inevitable paperwork that would grant him passage home. He was now 27, but felt a lifetime older than the nervous printer who had enlisted 4 years prior. His uniform was threadbare, his body was thin and riddled with chronic aches from old wounds and the endless damp of the trenches, and his eyes held a gaze that had seen too much death to ever look upon the world lightly again. The physical scars were manageable, the graze on his arm, a lingering cough, but the emotional ones were permanent, the phantom image of Timmy in the cornfield, the cold, necessary deception of his time behind enemy lines. The journey back to Cincinnati was slow. Elias traveled by foot, then train, the landscape sliding by like a memory reel. The North looked vibrant and whole, untouched by the kind of devastation that ravaged Virginia. But, as he looked at the civilian faces who cheered the returning heroes, he felt an immediate, jarring disconnection. They saw a victor. He felt like a survivor. When he finally arrived back in Cincinnati, the city was draped in patriotic bunting. His mother, Martha, met him at the station. She didn't rush him with loud tears or embraces. She simply looked into his eyes, and in that long, steady gaze, they both acknowledged the gulf between the boy who left and the man who returned. "Welcome home, Elias," she whispered, her voice rough with relief and fear. Returning to his old life was the greatest challenge. He visited the composing room of the Enquirer. The familiar smell of ink and oil was intoxicating, but the noise of the presses was too rhythmic, too peaceful. The world of predictable lines of type seemed trivial after the chaos of the battlefield. Old Silas, the editor, offered him his job back immediately. "You're a hero, Elias. write your story. We'll give you a column." Elias sat down at his old compositor's station, picking up a composing stick. But his hands, trained to set type, now felt clumsy and hesitant. He tried to set a single line, "The war is over." The words felt inadequate, a shallow summary of 4 years of hell. He couldn't write the story of glory the people wanted. He couldn't describe the terror without making them uncomfortable. He realized the true meaning of the great struggle was not the preservation of the Union, though, that was vital, but the colossal, unrecoverable cost paid by men like him, and by the millions of dead, both blue and gray. One evening, he watched a parade celebrating the Union's triumph. The speeches were full of flowery rhetoric about liberty and God's providence. Elias stood apart, leaning against a lamp post. He respected the victory, but he carried its weight. Liberty had been preserved, but at the expense of an entire generation's innocence. He knew he couldn't return to just printing the news. He had to bear the news. His new purpose was not to forget, but to ensure that the quiet tragedy of the front line was remembered alongside the grand triumph of the nation. The weight of victory was the responsibility to ensure the sacrifices were not cheapened by easy rhetoric. Elias Vance would eventually pick up the composing stick again, but he would not just be a printer. He would become a quiet, persistent voice in the city, using his column to remind his readers of the real scars beneath the hero's uniform. He had survived the fire, and now he had to teach a grateful, but largely ignorant, nation what it truly meant to say, "Lest we forget."